Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on cities addressing food insecurity during COVID-19 and beyond. Like was mentioned, my name is Clarissa Hayes, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at FRAC. Thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation. We know how everyone has been very busy the last couple of months, so we really appreciate your interest and participation today. So this webinar is co-hosted by the National League of Cities, who we have partnered with for many years on supporting cities as they implement and support the expansion of the federal nutrition programs. We really wanted to host this webinar and thought it was timely because we know that across the country, communities and households are continuing to deal with the impacts of COVID-19 on food insecurity. Cities can play a really critical role in addressing hunger by incorporating food access in as a city priority. This is definitely true pre-COVID-19, and it's even more important now considering the rising unemployment rate. City officials and city agencies can help to expand the federal nutrition programs by operating them or by working with other groups to serve meals at city buildings. They can convene anti-hunger work groups and set benchmarks for participation. They can allocate resources to help support food access, and they can also work with anti-hunger partners to reach more eligible families. So the goal of today's webinar is to provide an overview of the available nutrition programs, some ideas for implementation, opportunities to leverage programs and COVID-19 funding, and then a look at 2 cities in action. So we have a very full agenda today with great speakers. Before we dive in and you get to hear from us throughout the hour, we would love to get a sense of who is joining us today on the webinar. So in just a moment, you should soon see a poll question show up on your screen. And what we would love to hear from you is what best describes your city's current involvement with anti-hunger programs and food access during COVID-19. So can you share if you aren't doing anything around food access, if it has remained the same, if you have launched any new programs or have drawn down new funding to support it, or if you are not a city, but a partner organization working with cities to support food access. So we will give everybody about 30 seconds to complete that, and we will show those results on the screen. All right, so we will go ahead and wrap that up. It should be showing up. We may be having some technical issues with our poll, but if we are not able to share that back now, we will make sure that those results are shared at a later point in today's webinar. Well, thank you for that feedback. It looks like just from the registration list, we do have a mix of people on the line, and we would love to hear from you and what you're working on. So with that, I'm going to quickly go over today's agenda. So we are going to start today with an insight on the role of cities in addressing food insecurity by Patrick Hain with the National League of Cities. From there, I'm going to give a brief overview of the various federal nutrition programs along with some ideas for city actions. Then we are going to touch on ways that cities can draw down and leverage funding to support food access work. And the part that I'm most excited about, we are going to hear from representatives from 2 cities, from Little Rock and Providence, on their anti-hunger efforts and how these have changed as a result of the current pandemic. So we are going to hear from Kathy Webb and KK DeRosset from the city of Little Rock and the Central Arkansas Library System, and then Ellen Steinar from the Healthy Communities Office at the City of Providence. And of course, we want to leave a lot of time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions as we go along for any of our speakers today, feel free to use the Q&A function on your screen. All right. So with that, before I turn it over to Patrick, I wanted to quickly set the scene with some data on food insecurity and to highlight the impact of COVID-19 on this issue. So as you probably know, data can be a really powerful tool for identifying pockets of need, underserved areas, and then to help develop city goals. So data can be a really critical tool for doing all of this. So in the data that we have before COVID-19, we know that more than 37 million Americans lived in a household that struggled against hunger. And then taking that one step further, we know that nearly 1 in 7 households with children could not buy enough food for their families. We also know that food insecurity disproportionately impacts Black and Hispanic households. So as you can see from this third bullet, households headed by African Americans, it's 21.2% higher than white non-Hispanic households. And then for Hispanics, it was about 2 times the rate of white non-Hispanic households. So if you are interested in more data on this, we do have this information on our website at brac.org. There's a section on hunger and poverty in America, and you can find national data as well as state data and links to find the information for your city. So on the next slide, we wanted to kind of bring this back to what's happening right now. So again, due to spikes in unemployment, in addition to other disruptions due to the pandemic, we know that hunger has increased in every community. Many partners have been putting out research on this topic. We know that young children are experiencing food insecurity at an unprecedented level of seen in modern times. We know from our partners at Feeding America that an additional 3.3 to 17 million households are expected to be newly food insecure. And then another point that I wanted to quickly just mention is that we know from the previous slide that food insecurity was about 1 in 7 for families with children, and we know now that it's about 1 in 5. And again, those racial and ethnic disparities are also persisting and present in the data that's been collected related to hunger at this time. So we wanted to share this again because it really does help to highlight the increased need we're seeing and the role that cities can play. Food insecurity and poor nutrition have serious consequences for the health and well-being of children, adults, and seniors. And even marginal food security, which is a lesser form of food insecurity, is linked to some of the most common and costly health problems in the U.S. So we wanted to give that snapshot of that data to leave you with something to think about here as we go through the rest of the webinar. But at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Patrick from the National League of Cities. He is the program manager of the Economic Opportunity and Financial Empowerment at NLC. So Patrick, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Clarissa. We're very excited to co-host this webinar with FRAC and the continued partnership between our organizations. Thank you for sharing that important data, although it is sobering. Next slide, please. So for those of you that may not know who we are a national association representing the over 19,000 towns, cities, and villages across the country, which includes a population of over 200 million folks. Next slide, please. So the CHAMPS work started in 2012 with support from the Walmart Foundation. This work initially focused on expanding the meal programs and over time has evolved as we learned from our city partners. So again, you'll see on the screen some of those big buckets, right? Participation in the summer after school meal programs, engagement, and really increased role of city government, whether that's as a sponsor or just really being at the table to pump this information out, increased cross-agency collaboration to make these programs and opportunities more effective, and then just using the bully pulpit in many ways to increase awareness of all the federal nutrition programs that the community could access. And later on, in some ways, we really helped cities in our last cohort create anti-hunger campaigns. Next slide, please. Thank you. In 2018, we really turned our focus to helping some cities think through the communications work that I just referenced and how to better connect their residents to SNAP and WIC. So on this page, you'll see 6 logos that represented those campaigns from Allentown, Miami Gardens, Winston-Salem, Jackson, Little Rock, and Durham. This cohort itself secured more than 100 new partners throughout their communities, from anchor institutions, library systems, YMCAs, businesses, and internal city departments like fire departments. Their work led to an additional 12,000 children participating in the meal programs and the creation of nearly 150 more meal sites. On the SNAP side, their work led to more than 13,000 households receiving information about SNAP, 1,050 received application assistance, and 677 households enrolled in SNAP. I would say since 2012, FRAC and NLC have worked with 77 cities and helping them feed over 152,000 additional children, more than 12.5 million meals. Next slide, please. Through this work, through the 7 years we did this work, we've learned a lot, quite frankly. And we know what it takes to make this work well, and that cities have a role in this work, right? That no matter where they are, whether they run these programs or helping, we have a role to help and make sure more of our residents know about this and can access it. So we've learned that you have to start with the data and keep coming back to it, to iterate, to make these programs better, and make sure you're hitting the target areas that you need to in order to address food insecurity in your community. On the meal program side, it's selling the benefits of the programs to stakeholders and partners and thinking about non-traditional folks too. And some of that includes business, right? The role that cross-departmental collaboration has and plays in this work too. So getting folks out of those silos. And finally, persistence. In some ways, it's about communication, but also in making sure that the different pieces are working together and working together better for the community. And so, with that, we thought long and hard with our partners and heard our cities, and we have, with continued support from the Walmart Foundation, we're exploring even more levers that city leaders can use to address food insecurity and food access. So I would ask everyone on this call and anyone that listens to this webinar to keep your eyes open for more from us. And with that, I will turn it back to Clarissa to provide an overview of the federal nutrition program.
Great. Thank you, Patrick, for that overview of CHANCE. So like Patrick mentioned, I am going to give a brief overview of the programs that are available to provide benefits and meals to families in every community across the country. I know that many of you may have some experience with some of them, maybe not others. I am finally able to see the poll, and it does look like many of you have launched new programs as a result of COVID. So it may be possible that you weren't working on one of these, but since the pandemic started, you have been. So I wanted to kind of set the scene with these. I will not be going too far into the weeds on these because we only do have an hour for this webinar, but definitely welcome any questions or follow-up after today's event. We have folks at FRAC who work on these programs, would love to connect and along with NLP help you work through a strategy to incorporate these into your work. I will also preface this by just saying quickly that many of these programs have seen changes to the way that they operate due to COVID-19. Previously, and just out of my own work working on the out-of-school time programs, many of them were considered congregate programs, which means that families and kids had to go to a site to get a meal. Obviously, we know with social distancing and many schools and programs being shut, those things had to change slightly. So we know that USDA has issued many flexibilities and waivers to allow for safety and for the meals to continue in a different way. So I think a large piece of the food access work moving forward, at least for the foreseeable future, is identifying those maybe new challenges that may be coming out because of that and working with those partners to adjust the programs to accommodate that. So I did want to add that brief piece. So you can see here a snapshot of all the programs. I won't list them off because we will be diving into all of them. So with that, we can go ahead to the next slide, and we're going to start with the out-of-school time program because although it does not feel like it, it is still summertime. So the summer and after-school nutrition programs, these provide free meals and snacks to children 18 and under at sites in low-income communities or those that serve primarily low-income children. So these really are meant to take the place of school breakfast and school lunch when the school year either ends for the summer or when the school day ends and children go to after-school programs. So summer sites can serve up to 2 meals. After school programs can do a meal and a snack. And all of these must meet USDA nutrition standards, which means that the meals that are being served are healthy. So like I mentioned, these programs are really essential to closing the hunger gap that exists outside of the school day, especially during the summer when we know that food insecurity rates increase, obesity increases. Many families don't have access to that kind of summer programming. So these programs are underutilized when you look at them compared to school breakfast and school lunch, and there's really a lot of opportunity for cities here because they can actually sponsor or operate the program, get that reimbursement rate, and provide those meals. So what can cities do to amplify these programs and to increase the reach? So like I mentioned, the biggest one that cities can do is identify where there are eligible areas in their city and serve meals at those locations. So they can be schools, parks, libraries, wherever children are congregating during the normal time. Right now, it really is about figuring out, where there are gaps in meal sites for those kind of grab and go and non-congregate models. So again, it does look very different right now than it usually does. The other piece for summer and after school that I'll mention is just the need to raise awareness. These programs are underutilized, and a big piece of that is just because families don't know where to go to get summer or after school meals. So many cities that we've worked with CHAMPS and other cities have taken on doing an awareness or public-facing campaign to share the word. Maximizing COVID-19 flexibility. So again, supporting those partners that are serving meals. And then just sharing data, like Patrick mentioned, data is so important, not only for kind of showing where the city is going, for setting benchmarks for participation, but for also getting those new partners at the table to collaborate. So the next programs that I will talk about are ones that you are probably very familiar with: the National School Lunch Program and National School Breakfast Program. These are the ones that are available during the school day at any school across the country. Meals are provided at either the free or reduced price or paid level. So there is pretty high participation in these programs when compared, for example, to summer and after school meals, because they have somewhat of a more captive audience. But there are still opportunities to expand participation by taking breakfast out of the cafeteria and serving in the classroom, doing second chance breakfast, which if kids don't get to school in time, they can still get a breakfast, allowing grab and go. Those are all some of the things that we have seen. The other piece of this too is providing meals at no cost, so either called universal meals. The community eligibility provision is another key piece of this. So school districts can opt in if they are a high poverty district to basically, if you're at a certain threshold, they can serve meals to all children free of cost. So we know that this is really critical because it reduces the stigma. If everybody's getting a meal, it makes it easier for others to participate. So that's one key thing that I wanted to flag. And again, going back to my point I made earlier, we know that school will look very different this year. I'm sure everyone has been hearing that schools are either going to be remote or some kind of hybrid model with staggered days and schedules. So again, USDA has issued waivers. So children or families can come to the school and pick up meals. They can be delivered, just kind of recognizing that not everybody will be in the school building. So it will look very different. And something that cities can do is to work with those school districts to see how they can amplify that message, how they can help with delivery, how they can bring other partners to the table. And then just generally encouraging them to do CEP, setting benchmarks for participation, and then mayors and city officials are key to promoting breakfast, whether it be a contest or, again, an awareness campaign. So the last thing I would like here for school meals is that TRAC does track participation in these programs on a national and state level, and we issue reports. So if you are curious about how your state is doing in these programs, you can find all of that information on our website. All right, so the next one that I wanted to touch on is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which is formerly known as food stamps. And this provides monthly benefits to eligible low-income people on a card to purchase food. So SNAP is the largest nutrition assistance program administered by the USDA. So I would just flag here that there are variations in the application process and the eligibility criteria, but overall, SNAP really plays a critical role in reducing hunger and poverty, and it actually lifted 3.2 million Americans out of poverty in 2018. So I know Patrick mentioned the work that we've done through CHAMPS, and SNAP was a relatively recent addition to the work that we partnered with cities on, but it really does make a lot of sense to add this to your anti-hunger work. So some of the ways that we've seen cities increase participation is to explore options for providing referrals or application assistance if you're able to, glean funding to help with that. I know that some of our cities have done that. If you are sharing other information at city offices or city events, can you include a brochure about SNAP and have someone talk about that? And then the last piece that I would say is a relatively, hopefully, easy lift for cities is just to coordinate and collaborate with your SNAP offices and see how the city can do a better job of promoting this really critical program. All right. So the next one that I want to talk about, and we're almost there, is WIC. This is the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, known as WIC because that is a mouthful. And this provides low-income pregnant women, new mothers, infants, and children with nutritious foods. So food, and then also nutrition education, and then improved access to health care. So we know that in fiscal year 2019, about 6.4 million participants received WIC benefits. And I have put on here too the contact at FRAC, who is our program expert. So Gary Henchy is our WIC person at FRAC. And if you have any specific questions about this and the resources that we have to amplify access, she would be a great person to connect with. But just broadly, some of the ways that cities can incorporate WIC into their work is similar to SNAP. So exploring options for cities to provide referrals or to help pre-screen for access, promoting WIC through city communication channels, and then again, facilitating coordination between city services and WIC offices. All right. So we wanted to talk about the senior nutrition programs because I know this is something that has been on everyone's mind just with the impact of COVID. So we know that too many of our nation's older adults are struggling against hunger. In 2018, about 9.7% of people aged 65 and over lived in poverty in the United States. So with that comes hunger and food insecurity. So there are a range of programs for seniors. SNAP is definitely the largest, but there are other options that cities can help promote. So home delivered meals are a big one, and these are usually done through Meals on Wheels, which you may be familiar with. This has had to change a lot during COVID just because, again, for need for safety and social distancing. So that's a way that a city could get involved. There are normally the congregate meal programs, which again are not operating in the same way right now, but those are usually served at senior centers and other locations where seniors are gathering. And then there's the commodity supplemental food program, which provides a package of food to seniors. So I've listed here a lot of our resources. If you are looking to do work around the senior nutrition programs and just supporting the seniors in your city more, I have a contact here. And then, more information on how to promote the programs, connect eligible seniors to programs. And then FRAC is very involved with partners on screening and intervening for food insecurity and then making referrals. So we do have a focus on senior hunger at our organization. All right. So the last one that I wanted to touch on is brand new. It's a brand new nutrition program. So through the Family's First Coronavirus Response Act, which seemed like a lifetime ago, they created the Pandemic Electronic Benefit Transfer Program. And I wanted to talk about this because this is a really critical opportunity to provide nutrition resources to families who lost access to free or reduced price school meals when schools closed in response to COVID-19, which I know that it seems like schools closed a long time ago, but many states are still working out their plans to get benefits to these households. So as you can see from this map, at this time, only Idaho is the only state that hasn't been approved for this program. So in your city, you can connect with your state to make sure that the benefits are getting out, that families are able to apply for them if there is an application process, and just to make sure that is moving along. But we feel that with schools closing, this really was a great option for families to get those meals or for children to get those meals that they were missing because of school closures. So before I turn it over to Patrick, I know I went through that really quickly. So again, if you have any questions, if you're completely new to the federal nutrition programs, we'd be happy to chat those through. But I just wanted to kind of circle back to this idea that we know that the rates of food insecurity are higher than they have been for a long, long time, and that is due to COVID-19 and the impacts of that. So I did want to talk about some opportunities to strengthen the programs during this time, and I know that many of you may not be able to do legislative work or any kind of advocating, but I wanted to just highlight some of the things that we are pushing at FRAC and that are our legislative priorities. So the first one is to boost SNAP benefits. So you can see from this graphic here what we are pushing for in the next legislative package. So to boost SNAP maximum benefits by 15%, to increase the minimum from 16 to 30, and then to suspend SNAP admin rule changes. So we feel like this is a really critical to supporting families overall. So if you are able to do any kind of advocating or legislative work, this is a priority for our organization. The other one is to expand the child nutrition waivers and flexibility. So I've mentioned these. We know, again, that schools still look very different. So one of the things that we're asking USDA to do is to actually allow programs to operate the summer nutrition programs all year round because it has a higher reimbursement. You can basically provide meals to all children free of cost. You don't have to individually qualify them. And it's easier for families to get to meal sites rather than having to go to the school building if they're not learning in schools. And then the last one is just to extend the Pandemic-EBT through the school year as another resource in the event of future school closures. So if you have any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them. But in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Patrick to talk about some more opportunities for federal funding. So Patrick, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Clarissa. So just like Clarissa, I'm going to do this quickly so we can get to the other speakers on our webinar today. So there were several funding streams that came through the CARES Act. The major one was the Coronavirus Relief Fund to states and cities. Only about 36 cities with more than 50,000 residents received funds directly. The funding is focused, expenses incurred for public health due to COVID, expenses not already accounted, and you have to use it or you lose it. So like the funding has to be out the door by December, the end of December of this year. Early guidance from Treasury showed allowable use of the funds to cover expenses for food delivery to residents, including older adults and other vulnerable populations. I would note that there was nothing in the bill that required states to share the funds with cities, but some states are doing this. For those city folks on the call, you need to work with your state if you haven't already to make sure that you can get some of this fund. One example is Massachusetts. They distributed $502 million to cities with populations under 500,000 and highlighted food insecurity as a potential use of those funds. Next slide, please. So additional funding opportunities are listed on this slide. I would call out the Community Development Block Grant funds. This includes $2 billion by formula to cities with over 50,000 residents. So if you get an annual appropriation of CDBG funds, you should have received these funds. I would note that cities can reprogram FY19 and FY20 CDBG funds that haven't been spent yet to address COVID-related concerns. You would need to have to do a 5-day public comment period to reprogram that money, but it is another flexible pot to consider if you haven't already. Next slide, please. On the state and local side that don't have specific federal strings, there are some sources that I wanted to point out. One of them is general funds at the state or local level that can be used to top off what is coming from the federal government, from the federal side. And some of this at the local level could be the flexibility of those federal funds flowing in. So for example, if you don't need it for one specific task anymore that was from the general fund, could you repurpose that to another space, like food insecurity and addressing that? So additionally, we've seen a large influx of private dollars as well. So whether that's philanthropy or the business community to kind of really look at this issue and to be helpful to the nonprofit partners that are working on these issues. So I have a question for you all, and I've just put it in the chat. Oh, and someone else did it for me, I think. So what funds are you using to support your anti-hunger work now? I'd be very interested to see what funding streams you're using, potentially what funding streams you're looking into. So please feel free to send that in the chat now. Next slide, please. The last thing I wanted to note is that NLC, in partnership with Bloomberg Philanthropies, is tracking actions that local governments are taking related to addressing COVID-19. I would encourage anyone to check out the site and make sure that your city's activities are included. you'll see actions that cities have taken to address access to food included in this, and it's specifically called out under food and nutrition. Right now we have a little over, I think it's 100 examples of what local communities are doing to look at this, and also some of the funding that they're utilizing to move to action. So what I'd like to do now is introduce our first city speakers and CHAMPS alum. These folks are from the Be Mighty Little Rock campaign, which has served over 1 million meals since it started and has created innovative solutions to increase food security by partnering with Public Transit Authority, their Public Transit Authority, Rock Region Metro, as well as the Clinton Foundation and the World Central Kitchen. We are joined today by KK DeRossett, who is the Be Mighty coordinator, and Kathy Webb, who is a member of the Little Rock City Board and is the executive director of the Arkansas Hunger Relief Alliance. I will now turn it over to Kathy.
Thank you, Patrick. And it is a real pleasure to be here today with both the National League of Cities and with FRAC. As Patrick mentioned, I'm a member of the Little Rock City Board. I'm in my second term, and on the board, one of my responsibilities is I chair the Children, Youth, and Families Commission, which is money for programs, intervention, treatment, or prevention, intervention, and treatment dollars for underserved youth. And in my role as a city board member and at the Hunger Relief Alliance, it's been a real pleasure to work with FRAC and the National League of Cities. Also a member of the National League of Cities, YEF. Little Rock is a city of 200,000. We have in our county a food insecurity rate pre-pandemic of 18% and a 22% childhood food insecurity, which is higher than the national rates pre-pandemic. And I'll point out that those numbers, which we achieved last year, that was the first time in a decade that we were below pre-recession numbers. So as we move on through this pandemic and through the unemployment, one of the things that we continue to worry about is how long it will take us to recover in this, which is has the potential to be far worse than the recession. In Little Rock, in the Little Rock School District, which has about 21,000 students, we have a 70% reduced meal population in the Little Rock School District. We rely on it in our city sales tax for about half of our revenue, and other taxes, sales and use, property taxes, and different things like that. And because of the way we collect and report on sales tax, we are typically at least 2 months behind because the state collects those taxes. So we only have reports through April, yet we know that we already have seen some significant financial impacts of COVID-19. For example, we're already down year to date 68% on our budget of fee for services, and that includes all of our parks and rec programs, things like golf, the zoo, things like that. So that is a significant chunk. Income from hotel occupancy, mixed drinks tax, all those things are way down. We also know that pre-pandemic, 25% of our Black residents lived in poverty, 30% of our Hispanic residents lived below the federal poverty line, versus 8% of our white residents. And we know that COVID-19 and the economic impact on our Black and brown residents has been disproportionate. And I don't have pandemic, but we know the collapse in the hospitality industry and all of the closures has disproportionately affected our communities of color. And we also know that the city programs that have been halted have disproportionately impacted our disadvantaged youth, many of whom are children of color. And the reason that is the case is because Clarissa talked about all of the federal nutrition programs and congregate programs. We obviously are not having any of those programs. So when we had our first city board meeting after the schools were shut down, we knew immediately that we were going to have to cut the budget. And what was painful as the chair of Children, Youth, and Families, the first $4 million we cut was from that budget. And the reason is, it's because we were canceling all those programs. And that included a summer youth employment program that we have 600 participants every year. And all of our out-of-school programs, summer programs, KK is going to tell you what we did, but that was one of the main ways we covered a lot of that initial shortfall. And as I said, KK is going to focus on the programs, not only the programs that affect children, but also some of the senior programs. But the city is also participating directly in the Farmers to Families USDA program. Of course, the food banks work in Little Rock and food pantries, but the city itself is sponsoring 2 distributions a week, and specifically targeted to the Latinx community. And then we're doing food boxes from Farmers to Families USDA program through some of the meal distribution that we're doing. The city is giving out information on WIC and SNAP at the food distribution sites. When people call the city to ask for help about a variety of services, the city steers people to food pantries, to meal sites, and in the Hunger Relief Alliance, we operate a statewide SNAP hotline where we take telephonic signatures and applications. So the city steers people to the SNAP hotline, and we coordinate with the Latinx community to pass out SNAP and WIC flyers in Spanish and English at all of the meal sites. One of the important programs that Clarissa talked about is P-EBT. We are working very closely with the Latinx community, and we go on the Hispanic radio station often, and one of the main things we've been talking about is P-EBT, because city's multicultural liaison spends a lot of time telling members of that community who are anxious for a number of reasons, who were anxious pre-pandemic, that if something looks too good to be true, it probably is. So with P-EBT, and people are getting these cards in the mail that may have their children's name on them for $319 on average, we're going on the radio station a lot to tell people, this is legitimate. You please use this card. We know that in Arkansas, there was about $96 million of Pandemic-EBT money that was released. The city has worked on advocacy, and we have had the mayor sign on a mayoral letter to work to increase Pandemic-EBT, including younger children, not just the school-age children. And we have had our congressman come to one of the Farmers to Families distributions. We've had different city council members assist with those distributions. last Sunday at our city council meeting, we had a proclamation that thanked all of our partners and talked about the USDA meals and also the non-USDA meals. And one of the important things to remember, and I say this also as a former state legislator, you don't need every elected official to be passionate about your anti-hunger efforts. You need one, and then that one can get a second. The city can be a convener of groups, as our city was on the very day that the governor announced that the schools were closed. The city convened the school district, the Hunger Relief Alliance, Be Mighty, a number of groups together. And we made a plan that afternoon so our kids had food immediately. The city can make sure that people are aware of programs by using some of the communications tools that we have. The city can pass ordinance and resolutions, particularly in the area of food access. We make sure that all of our departments are aware of the different opportunities for food access. And in Little Rock, we've got a lot of park space, and we have the Hunger Relief Alliance. Prior to my being elected to the Little Rock City Board, we use some of that park space, and we get approximately 30,000 pounds of fresh produce from that space that goes directly into homes of our low-income residents. We have Hunger Awareness Month in September, Hunger Action Month, and inviting your elected officials to a variety of events. So there are a lot of things that the city can do, and KK will give you specific examples of the programs in Little Rock, additional examples.
Yeah, I'll get started. So thank you, Kathy. I coordinate Be Mighty Little Rock, which started in late 2018 thanks to the work of Patrick and Clarissa and through the CHAMPS grant. So our goal with the campaign is to connect kids and teens to free after-school weekend and summer meals. And I serve as a liaison between our state agency, DHS, and USDA meal sites throughout our city. So I help recruit new sites and also promote existing sites so that their participation increases. Communication is a big piece of Be Mighty Little Rock, and as part of our CHAMPS grant, we were able to create a website where we continue to host a list of the different meal sites around town, what days they're open, the times that they serve meals, as well as an interactive map where you can find the meal site closest to you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did pre-COVID and then go into how we've changed since schools closed in March and throughout the summer, and what we have planned going forward. So before COVID, we helped increase participation in after-school and summer meal programs throughout the city of Little Rock. One of the goals we were focused on for this year was to provide complete meal coverage throughout our city. Our vision was to work with the library system, the school district, and Parks and Recreation to collaborate on our meal offerings, guaranteeing service throughout the city 7 days a week. This also included weekends, school breaks like spring break, and the Christmas holiday break, as well as summer. As we were setting our goals for this year, we were also planning to work with Parks and Recreation and the library system, as well as community programs to implement food security screenings at USDA meal sites and doing a follow-up referral with families that express need. At the start of 2020, the library system entered a fair agreement with the local transit authority, Rock Region Metro, to provide free monthly bus passes to 1,000 youth traveling from home to libraries and other meal sites to receive resources like internet access, computers, and free after-school and weekend meals. This has been put on hold because of COVID and the challenges that our local transit authority is facing due to the pandemic, but we hope to be able to continue that when it's safe to do so. So a lot has changed due to COVID. We've still been able to work towards most of our goals since things changed in March. As Kathy was saying, schools closed in mid-March, and we were able to get a group of community leaders together to begin providing meals the next day. And we have been able to offer complete meal coverage 7 days a week since March 13th. And in a way, COVID propelled us to begin making changes and implementing our goals right away, rather than waiting until summer meals started. So the library system began serving meals 7 days a week in March, and the school district began serving meals Monday through Friday, distributing a breakfast and lunch. Other USDA meal sponsors slowly came back on in March and April and continued to serve and adapt their programs throughout the summer. So one unique thing about our local partners is that the Clinton Foundation is located in Little Rock. We have a presidential library, and it's just a beautiful facility and a great asset to our community. They were able to come on board in mid-March and partner with World Central Kitchen to provide non-USDA meals at our existing USDA meal site. So we had a mix of USDA and non-USDA meals throughout our city. So the libraries and schools were serving USDA meals at lunch and breakfast, and then World Central Kitchen and the Clinton Foundation were able to recruit volunteers and even hire some of the food trucks that weren't able to operate normal business and distribute dinner meals that were for adults and kids at various different sites throughout, not just our city, but throughout Pulaski County. We've seen an increase in participation in our USDA and non-USDA meal programs, partly because of the grab-and-go non-congregate option, but also because there's a greater need. We've also been able to distribute additional things at meal sites. So we're able to give away masks to people that aren't wearing face coverings so that we keep our staff, volunteers safe, as well as educate them on COVID safety. We're able to give away books and activity packets. So we've partnered with a variety of different organizations to provide more than just food at our meal site. And as we transition from summer meals to after school meals, we are looking to USDA for guidance on how we can continue the non-congregate waivers and follow their guidelines and keep our community safe while also continuing our meal program. So we are gearing up to transition from summer meals to after school meals at the end of August. So we will continue to update our website and work with our partners to keep everyone informed about where they can go for meal service.
Great. Well, thank you, KK and Kathy, for that oversight. I would highly recommend everybody checking out the Be Mighty website to see more pictures and to see what they have been able to coordinate, not only through CHAMPS, but as you heard from them over the last couple months. It's been really impressive. So we are going to go ahead and turn to our next city speaker. And I know that we are running kind of not short on time. We're running late in the hour, but we're going to power through and keep this going. So if you have to hop off, again, we will be sharing the recording, but we want to make sure that Ellen's able to share all of her great information. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ellen with the City of Providence to talk about their COVID work during this time. So Ellen, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Clarissa. So again, my name is Ellen Steinar. I'm the Director of the Healthy Communities Office for the City of Providence. Next slide. So just to give you an orientation, Rhode Island is a state, is not an island. We are sandwiched in between Connecticut and Massachusetts, and we are not a borough of New York. We are a mid-sized city, 178,000 residents. Providence is the capital city of Rhode Island, and the saying goes, as goes Providence, so goes the state. And we're blessed with really significant racial and ethnic diversity, particularly as it compares to the state as a whole. So for example, 15% of our state's residents identify as Hispanic, where our Hispanic population makes up about 42% of Providence residents. Next slide. So the Healthy Communities Office was established back in 2012, and we are like an old school CHAMPS alumni. So we've been doing this work since the CHAMPS work came on as well. We lead the city's health policy and advocacy efforts, and we have a fair amount of experience in food systems work. And important to all these conversations is we also have a lot of good relationships with other city departments, state agencies, community-based organizations, and faith leaders. I will note that we are not a local department of health, so we don't have local public health authority. And I want to share that I'm presenting a lot of efforts on behalf of the city of Providence, but really this is the work of so many partners within the city, within city government, at the community level. And again, I'm only presenting the city's perspective on this work. We have a lot of groups that I won't be able to mention that have been doing really significant food access work within the city of Providence. Next slide. So pre-COVID, about half of our Providence youth received SNAP benefits. The majority of our public school students are free and reduced eligible, and a quarter of our residents are living below the poverty level. And we know that because these are all pre-COVID stats, a lot of these numbers are in flux. Next slide. So pre-COVID, the city really only manages child nutrition programs. Providence doesn't manage any federal food or cash transfer programs. We don't manage any adult congregate meal sites or even the programs or the sites specifically. So a lot of our focus has been on youth families, increasing our out of school time meal participation, and more recently working on inclement weather and holiday food access. And again, a really tremendous thank you to NLC and FRAC. A lot of the successes that you'll hear about during this pandemic were due to the investments that NLC and FRAC made in the city of Providence years ago. We've been starting to focus on older adult food access. And then functionally really important to this conversation, about a year ago, we embedded food access into Providence's emergency advisory board calls. So the city holds these EAB calls when there is an emergency. And so last year we included food access as one of the update steps during these calls. So we really already had a template for how to engage food access during an emergency. Next slide. So at the beginning of the pandemic, Providence Mayor Jorge Elorza signed an executive order on March 12th, which activated our PEMA, the Providence Emergency Management Agency for Emergency Operations. It's our local level version of FEMA. We also have a state level emergency program called RAIMA. And the Healthy Communities Office was designated to lead the city's food response given the work that we've done in the past. We really had to reconsider our existing emergency food distribution plans, however. So the city of Providence had an emergency food response, but it's really structured to respond to sort of a discrete incident followed by recovery. So for example, a hurricane and then you recover. But this pandemic has really unfolded over a long period of time and doesn't allow for your more traditional emergency congregate food distribution. So what we were trying to figure out and really still are trying to figure out is how do we sustain long-term socially distanced distribution that minimizes the amount of human exposure. Next slide. So for child nutrition programs, on March 17th, the school department initiated a grab and go service. This was in collaboration with our Parks and Recreation departments. The Parks department really has, they're really the experts in our out of school time food distribution. So it was a good partnership between multiple city agencies. And so we stood up a mix of 24 sites throughout the city. We had schools that were operating lunch and breakfast service. between 11 and 2, and then the rec centers would come on from a 4 to 6 p.m. Service time. We later opened up a few housing authority sites and a kosher meal site. We quickly shifted to multi-day service on Tuesdays and Fridays, and then we leveraged any USDA and state waiver that we could, including the use of CACFP and SFSP, multi-day, guardian pickups, delivery, sort of you name it, we were trying to make it work. We recently switched over to our sort of more traditional summer meal service on July 1st. We are still serving at some multi-day sites. Go. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of other priority groups beyond youth families, obviously can you go back a slide, please? We're concerned about older adults with underlying conditions. We're also concerned about individuals and families who are not engaged directly with food bank served organizations. So our food bank has member agencies, and in order to get food bank from the Rhode Island Community Food Bank, you really need to be a member of that agency network. To utilize federal food benefits, federal income supports, and then families and youth who are uncomfortable utilizing public food supports in general. A lot of times we were focusing on immigrant families, undocumented individuals, or families who were just afraid to be in the public setting. And I have to apologize, I have small helpers in the background. Next slide.
Sorry, there's a slight delay. I'm having some connectivity problems.
It's okay. My speak authentic access efforts and food access coordinating calls at the local level. We were engaging directly with state agencies because all of our authority is at the state level. It was really important for us to have open lines of communication with our state agents. There we go. And the state brought in a lot of food, including MREs and increased Meals on Wheels capacity, especially for the city of Providence. We were coordinating directly with the food bank, and we were leveraging and coordinating a lot of food donations. So a significant amount of our work during the past few months has actually been influencing and managing donated food distribution. We have not received direct food funding assistance through CARES. We're not one of those 500,000 or larger cities, and our state did not issue us local food support money. And so we've been working to get the donated food to community-based organizations and faith leaders, especially those that were working with those priority groups that I had mentioned earlier. And then we were oftentimes providing technical assistance on socially distanced food distribution to organizations that we weren't necessarily giving food directly to, but were doing food distribution in the city of Providence. Next slide. Communications. So thank you, my communications team, if you're listening. Could not have without you. Our comms team started up a new website called P-EBT COVID-19. It housed all of the city's COVID-related resources. We were doing a tremendous amount of Spanish language translation. A significant number of our residents are most comfortable in Spanish, and so it was really important that we were putting out information in both English and Spanish. We used all of our communication levers, radio, email, social media promotion. The mayor was on everything. And then the mayor also convened a few affinity groups, which is really important given how COVID has played out disproportionately in communities of color. So we have a Latinx leaders group that was meeting on a regular basis with phone calls, and an African American ambassadors group. And these groups are still meeting. And then really important for Providence, we were reorienting a lot of the state's messaging for a Providence audience to make sure that our residents were really hearing the important information that the state was sharing down. And we had to be really careful at the local level not to put out stale or inaccurate information. And I'm sure for those of you in the food world, just trying to keep up with every waiver, every new announcement, every new opportunity, that was a big challenge. And so we're trying to keep up with everything as it was moving so quickly. Next slide, please. So an example of a state to city messaging reorientation is with Pandemic-EBT that Clarissa had talked about previously. So Rhode Island is actually the first state to launch Pandemic-EBT. So we're we're sort of the guinea pigs for the country. And so while the state manages Pandemic-EBT, it significantly impacted Providence residents. We have the largest population in the state, and also Providence Public the community eligibility provisions. So that means that all 24,000 of our public school students and many of our private charter or parochial school students were free reduced eligible. And so our work, very similar to Little Rock, was really to validate the benefit especially for families who don't participate in SNAP. So if you participate in SNAP already, the money went on to your EBT card. But if you don't participate in SNAP, you did receive a random email or a random envelope in your mailbox that said, here's money for your child for food. And so a significant amount of our focus was on families who had concerns about using the benefit. Next slide. All right, so what worked? I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because a lot of what I have shared is about what works. We had food system knowledge. We actually had a lot of food related or volunteers that were doing food related work through PEMA, which was amazing. We had food plans. We had a lot of good relationships sort of horizontally and vertically in the city. Next slide. So the challenges. So there's existing and growing food insecurity in Providence, as same as across the country. We had limited food options, and so you often wind up having to make a choice about who is more food insecure, who is more vulnerable. And at this time, it becomes very tricky because you're often asking yourself, is this COVID related? Is this generally food insecurity related? Or most likely, is it both? Since up large quantity groups to pick all that food up. And so what that meant is we often had limited distribution partners. So our community-based organizations, one, had to be online. Many of our community-based organizations and our food pantries could not keep their doors open because they too were impacted by COVID. And so we had to really stretch when we came to who could actually help distribute the food. They had to be able to pick up a large amount of food and turn around and get it out to a lot of people very quickly or put it into storage. We had a vulnerable volunteer system. I'm sure many of you know that a lot of volunteers across the country, especially those that work in the food distribution world, happen to be older adults. And those were the most vulnerable people during this time. Food type and options. We found that the MREs were not appropriate for this pandemic. We lacked culturally, medically, and religiously appropriate food. Oftentimes the donations that we were getting were unitized, where families were really interested in getting grocery style food to be able to cook their own food at home. It's an emergency, but most people's kitchens are still working. And then we just had a lot of non-perishable food, which makes a ton of sense in an emergency, but we know that families were really, really, really lacking quality fresh fruit and vegetables. For SNAP and WIC utilization barriers, I feel like I could spend hours talking about this, but there were major barriers to home delivery and then just the comfort and ability to use benefits like this during a pandemic. We've had very low participation in WIC, or redemption in WIC, I should say. Rhode Island's just moving over to EWIC, and I find grocery shopping to be very stressful. And now you add in young children, financial insecurity, limited WIC product availability, it just becomes untenable. We have limited city staff during the beginning of the pandemic, and now many cities are furloughing or laying off staff. And then, fatigue and sustainability. How do we keep doing what we're doing when the system's getting really tired? And then I do want to call out, probably the most important thing is systemic racism. There are really significant racial disparities in this pandemic, and they play out here in Providence. And these are not new disparities. And these disparities, just like food disparities, are really outcomes of systemic racism in the United States. Next slide, please. I wanted to call out a few city level purchasing and distribution challenges. So I know this is kind of in the weeds, but those of you who work in cities know that you're only as good as your ability to purchase something and have a purchase order. And I will say many cities are just not in the business of buying and distributing food, including the city of Providence. And if we do buy food, it's often through a food service management company, and it's not necessarily in the sort of grocery emergency distribution, multi-day. And even if we did have money in hand, we actually had trouble at the very beginning finding a grocer to actually purchase from because of supply constraints. For FEMA reimbursement considerations, so the Stafford Act allows for 75% reimbursement for emergency related expenses, and that includes some food related expenses. But this is all reimbursable and can really significantly impact the cash flow of a city. And oftentimes FEMA reimbursements are coming back years and years later. And so it's really important when cities are facing these financial crises and are slashing budgets, asking cities to spend even more and not know when the reimbursement is going to come back is very challenging. And then finally, safe food and transport storage. So even if you have food on hand, it doesn't mean you can get it to the people who need it the most. And so, many cities don't have refrigerated trucks. Our cold storage was totally taken up by our child nutrition program food, which makes a ton of sense. I don't have, forklifts and pallet things, so it puts a strain, even if you do have the food, even if you have the money and you have the food, how are you actually transporting it safely? Next slide, please. So moving forward, we are planning for a surge this fall. We're supporting SNAP delivery, home delivery concepts. We are remaining flexible with child nutrition program services, but the way that we understand it is that this SFSP flexibility is not being looked upon favorably for this fall, and that is going to be a really big challenge for us in Providence. We're working to get more of our community-based organizations into our food bank agency network, focusing on multi-day, weekly distribution, trying to diversify our food options. We are advocating to the state for food funding, including storage and transport help. So we have made very specific asks and would really love some of those CARES funding dollars to come into the city, and then advocating for any waiver, extension, or enhancement that can come through. So that is it from the City of Providence, and thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions now or later.
Just thanking Ellen for her time and that she's a great resource and the city is doing so much. I said it a lot better the first time I said it. So I'm just going to go ahead. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know many of you stayed on after we wrapped to listen in. So I've been answering the questions as they have come in. So if you ask a question, make sure to check out the Q&A, and we will make sure to follow up with everybody who we didn't get to, but again, want to be respectful of everyone's time. So the speakers from today are listed here. On the next slide, you should see a list of track and NLC resources along with my email address and Patrick. So again, if you have any questions for us or for our speakers today, feel free to reach out, and we would love to connect with you, hear what you're working on, hear how we can support you, and put you in touch with today's wonderful speakers. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. Thank you so much, Patrick, Kathy, KK, and Ellen for joining us today and for staying on a little bit late. This recording will be shared along with the resources that we've mentioned, so we'll make sure everybody gets that in a follow-up email. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.